Good morning, and I hope you're having a great week and ready to dig into the Word this morning. I've entitled this morning's message, The Messiah and His Glory. Last week we looked on Easter Sunday at the King and the Kingdom, and this is just another take on it, The Messiah and His Glory. If we follow Jesus from the resurrection Sunday to His ascension, which occurs 40 days later, there is one predominant theme. He is alive, and that His resurrected body is the exact same body that was crucified on the cross, placed in the tomb, and raised up by the power of the Holy Spirit. We're going to see more about that as we go through the scriptures this morning, but He appeared to the women on resurrection morning as they came to the tomb to anoint His body and with burial spices, and then to a gathering of the disciples on that first Sunday evening. And that afternoon, He walks along the road to Emmaus with two of His followers, and you know the story. They didn't recognize who He was. And so we're going to pick up that story in Luke chapter 24, because there's some very significant things revealed in this passage. We're going to start at verse 21. We were hoping that it was He who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it's the third day since these things happened. But also, some women among us amazed us when they were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find His body. They came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said He was alive. And some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just exactly as the women also had said, but Him they did not see. Now this is Jesus who interjects here as He's walking along with them. O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Now I want you to grab hold of that comment there, because again, we're at 3 days past the resurrection. We're at the day of the resurrection, 3 days after the crucifixion, and at this point they still are clueless. And Jesus chides them with those words, O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be unpacking all that the prophets have spoken related to the Messiah. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things? And again, whenever you read the word Christ, just interject the word Messiah. That's what it means. Was it not necessary for the Messiah, the promised Messiah, to suffer these things? And then I want you to pay attention to this, to enter into His glory. It was necessary for Him to suffer these things and to enter into His glory. And we're going to look at that this morning. Then beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, He explained to them the things concerning Himself in all the scriptures. And that would be all the Old Testament scriptures, the law, the prophets, and the Psalms and the wisdom literature. So, how would you have liked to have been one of those who was standing there who He begins to explain everything to? Anybody still have questions? Two things in this passage for us to focus on. One, they say, we were hoping that it was He who was going to redeem Israel. And at this moment, their hopes are completely dashed. The one that they had thought was the Messiah was dead. And it tells us that all the way through the crucifixion, even His closest followers were clueless. They had believed the Jewish concept of a rebirth of the physical, geo-political kingdom of Israel. And they completely missed all of the prophecies concerning the rejection of the Messiah by His own people and His suffering and eventually His cruel death. The second thing we see in the passage is that Jesus explains the nature of His kingdom to them. It was necessary for the Messiah to suffer these things and to enter into His glory, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, He explained to them the things concerning Himself in all the scriptures. So what does that tell us? That the crucifixion and the resurrection was the glory of Jesus. That is the glory of Jesus. He essentially tells these disciples on the road to Emmaus that he had entered into his glory. And that everything about his kingdom that was prophesied in the Old Testament, but they had completely missed it. And they were looking for a physical kingdom, a military conqueror. They were looking for the rebirth of Israel and did not catch the fact that the glory of God was going to be displayed in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. The Apostle John and the Apostle Peter, if you do a word study on the word glory or glorified, it's all over the New Testament. There's over 100 references to that word. But it's the Apostle John and the Apostle Paul that speak more than the other New Testament writers about the glory of Jesus, and they specifically tie it to the resurrection. So in John chapter 12, and if you want to turn there, we're going to be there for a few verses. In John chapter 12, we have the story of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem for the final time, and the Old Testament scriptures prophesying that this is the presentation of the king to the daughters of Zion, and it's said by the writers, whether it's Matthew or Luke or John, that this is the fulfillment of that moment. And in John chapter 12, verse 16, we find this: these things his disciples did not understand at the first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things were written of him and that they had done these things to him. So again, we have this reference to Jesus being glorified, and it wasn't until that moment that kind of the lights came on. Immediately following this triumphal entry, Jesus declares that his hour has come. So what hour is this? In verse 27, John 12. Now my soul has become troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I came to this hour. Now this is just days before the crucifixion, and I want you to, there's a lot of debate in some theological circles regarding whether or not the crucifixion was actually the plan of God, plan A. Can I just tell you there was only one plan? There wasn't a plan B. Plan A was that Jesus would come, he would be rejected, he would be crucified, and he would be raised. That was the plan. And he says very emphatically at this moment, right before the crucifixion, for this purpose, I came to this hour. And then he cries out, Father, glorify your name. And then a voice comes out of heaven. You can just put a voice booms out of heaven. I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. It was through the brutal crucifixion and the miraculous resurrection that he was glorified. Now, despite the miracles that he had done, and we know that, you remember, before John the Baptist was killed, he sent a delegation of his disciples just to make sure Jesus, if I'm going to have my head chopped off over this deal, I want to make sure it's for the right cause. And so they say, John has sent us to find out, are you really the one? And his answer was, go back and tell John what you've seen. The dead are raised, the blind receive sight, the deaf can hear, the lame walk. In other words, the miracles that he had done was the proof that he was who he claimed to be, which was the Messiah of Israel. And despite all that, the Jews watched him perform these miracles, and for the most part, they rejected him as the Messiah. Now here in John chapter 12, the Apostle John tells us that their rejection of Jesus as the Messiah was to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah. And he says, Isaiah who saw his glory. So here's the writer of the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, over 700 years before the crucifixion, who writes in Isaiah chapter 6, you'll recall the opening line, in the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord. Now the Apostle John quotes from Isaiah chapter 6. And he says this beginning at verse 39. For this reason, speaking of the Jews, they could not believe. For Isaiah said again, he has blinded their eyes, and he hardened their heart, so that they would not see with their eyes, and perceive with their heart, and be converted, and I heal them. These things Isaiah said because he saw the glory of Christ, and he spoke of Christ. Now, that's a huge revelation. And what's very significant, too, is this verse appears several other times in the New Testament. Matthew uses this verse when the disciples have heard Jesus telling a parable. It was actually the parable of the sower of the seed in Matthew chapter 13. And they come to Jesus and say, explain to us the parable. Why, when you've got this big crowd of people out here who you're trying to bring into the kingdom, and nobody can understand a single word of what you're saying, why do you speak to them in parables? And Jesus responds with this direct quote from Isaiah chapter 6 that says, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart so that they would not see with their eyes and understand or perceive with their heart and be converted. In other words, they were blinded because of the hardness of their hearts. So as we look back to Luke chapter 24, and these two disciples on the road to Emmaus, they invite this stranger who's walking along with them and talking to them, they invite him to stay and eat. And he did. And as he breaks the bread with them, it says that their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They immediately knew at the something about at the sound of his voice, at the breaking of the bread, at the prayer over the meal, it was revealed to them, this is Jesus, and then boom, he's gone.